Okay, so we know our different trait formats. We know how to walk through the app itself. Tomorrow we're going to be collecting the data in the field. But before we get to that point, I wanted to go over some of the advanced settings that we've built into the app to really assist and optimize how data is collected. All right, so to access our advanced settings, we're going to go back to our settings screen. So go to this menu right here. So now within this menu, we also see the name of the person that we set earlier and the current file that we're on as well. So from this menu, we can access our settings, we can look at our fields, we can change our traits, and we can reset our person, location, or language if we need to as well. So we're going to go to Settings. And the advanced settings are in the Advanced section. So we'll go to that. And so these are all settings that are not necessary for the core functionality of the app. But depending on what you're collecting, how you're collecting, and the level of proficiency you have with using Fieldbook, some of them are really useful. So the first one we'll talk about is the tutorial. So you can follow along and set this. So we'll add the check mark to the tutorial. We will click OK. And now on the main screen, the settings screen, the traits screen, and the field screen, we have this extra question mark up at the top. And so if we click on that question mark, we have this multi-step, just semi-guide on how to use Fieldbook. If there's a question you have or something that's not clear, you can walk through this on any of those screens, and it'll walk you through step by step on actually using Fieldbook. So in this case, this is on the settings. So it does exactly what we already did, step by step. So traits, profile, exporting data, which we'll get to, and then talking about advanced settings. If I go back to the main screen, we have 7 steps that we can walk through using each of these, depending on where we are, to kind of tell us how to use the app and how to collect data. So I'll close that. I'll go back to the settings, back to advanced, and uncheck tutorial, and check next entry with no data. So this is a fairly simple trait. Essentially, we have a new button on our main collection screen, this arrow up at the top. So if I have data in, and I'm just entering in dummy data for the time being, if I have data in the first 3 plots and I want to go to the next plot without data, I just hit that button up at the top, and now I'm on plot number 4. So this is really helpful when collecting things like flowering. Again, a lot of flowering is kind of annoying to collect as a trait, especially when you have hundreds of lines to go through, because you can just move instantly to the plot or that hasn't had data collected for it. And this works on a trait-by-trait basis. So if we go to our next trait, in this case color, and go to our next empty plot, it'll just take us to plot number 2. Now, if there's any need for clarification, like this is two-way, so you need to stop and ask questions. So open up our menu, go back to settings, go into advanced. We'll uncheck next entry with no data, and check quick go to. And so what this setting does, now back on our main screen, all right, so in this case, we'll pretend that the first 10 entries are plants instead of plots, so ignore the word plot. So we have data on the first 6 of them for height. If I hit the jump button, it'll take me to number 7. Now if number 7 is missing, or if there's no data for number 7, then it'll always go there with the jump button for that trait. Now if it's a missing value, we can hit the exclamation point at the bottom and store an NA to know that we can't collect it, to distinguish between something uncollected and actually missing.
I thought it jumped from 6 to 8, so
yeah, you understand, okay. All right, so we're on quick go to. So minor difference between this screen and the previous screen is that these 2 boxes are now editable, and they serve as a search box. So if I select this plot box and type in plot 199 and search, or hit enter, it moves me directly to that plot. So it's a fast way to move if you know exactly where you need to move to. We'll talk about some other ways to move very quickly as well. Okay. So moving to the next one. This is always the funnest one when you have this many people and this many devices. Primary order sound. So we'll select that. We'll click OK. We'll go back. And now, what was our primary order when we imported the file? Row. Yeah, whoever said, all the people that said row get points. And points are how you get phones. They're not, sorry. So, our primary order being row, when this value changes, it makes a sound. So, and then as you move forward, so this is really useful in, yeah. Really useful in crops where you have a lot of plots and you might move from nursery to nursery without actually knowing you entered a new nursery. And it serves as an auditory reminder to move up to the next row. It happens a lot. You'd be surprised. So back to settings, back to advanced. We're going to uncheck primary order sound. And we're going to check camera barcode scanner. We'll click OK. We'll go back. So new icon. Up at the top, we have this barcode. So if we select that, we get this. You get to see my shoes. We get this barcode scanning app. And now if we're out in the field and we have barcodes on our plots, we can scan that barcode and move directly to that plot. So that's why it's so important for your barcodes to match your unique IDs within Cassava Base. Okay, so back to settings, back to advanced. Uncheck camera barcode scanner, and we'll check move to unique identifier. We'll go back to the main screen. And so this is actually just, essentially it does the exact same thing, but instead of opening the barcode scanner directly, it allows us to type in our barcode if we want to do that. So if we have an external barcode scanner that we want to use instead of the inbuilt tablet or phone barcode scanner, we can use that. So we will close that. I can. So if I type 14 RPN, 0, 0, how many zeros? 4 zeros. 5, that's 3 zeros. And click OK, then it'll move us directly to that plot. So back to the menu, back to settings, back to advanced. Uncheck move to unique identifier. Check data grid. Click OK, but we're going to do something different first. We're going to go to our traits. So how do I, sorry, I forget. How do I uncheck all the traits at once? Okay, yeah, thanks. Double check mark to uncheck all of them. So we still want to collect a few though. So we want our height, our color, and our insect damage, whether or not it has insect damage. So we'll go back. We'll go back here, and we have a new icon. We have this grid. It's kind of in beta, but it's still there. And it only works for a small number of traits, so that's why we had to do that step. But here we can see the data that's been collected for all of the traits that are currently active. We can see where data hasn't been collected. And if we need to move to any of these traits or any of the plots, we can select that value and hold. And now we're on plot number 9. So if I go back, so I can close this. We will go back to the menu, back to settings, back to advanced, scroll down, disable data grid. And so I'm just going to explain the next one, and then we'll have another orchestra after that. So when files are exported, the app asks you if you want to share those files. Now, by share, I mean email, send to Dropbox, you can send via Bluetooth. Really anything that's installed on your device can be accessed or used to share if the app that is sharing says that I can share. And so if you don't want that option, you can disable that. But from my experience, most people do, and that's why I leave it enabled by default. Okay, so skipping disable file sharing, going on to disabling the left and right entry arrows. And so this was actually requested by my boss because he kept skipping plots when he was collecting this data set. And he wanted there to be a way to not be able to progress forward without collecting data. Wanted a complete set of data for this trait and for this trial. And so if we select both of those and go back, now if there's no data, you cannot go to the next plot. And so if I hit the next plot button, you get this really annoying sound. So yeah, if I go to a different trait and it does have data, I can move forward. So it's within, if it doesn't have data, then you cannot move forward. So if you collect all of the trait data for one plot, then yeah, you'd be able to move forward just because there's no missing values there either. So now if there's a missing value though, like we covered earlier, you have this button at the bottom. So now if I give that plot an A, now I can go to the next one, but I can't go beyond that. We'll scroll down, we'll disable both of those. The next one that I want to cover is cycling traits advances entry. So I'll select that. And this is a really useful setting. And there's going to be questions about it, but just hear me out. When you're collecting data on a plot, there's a lot of times where you want to collect multiple traits, and you want to collect all of those, and then move on to the next plot. So in this case, if we click on our traits, we can see the traits that we currently have active. We have our height, our color, our insect damage. And so if I go to the next trait, in this case, it'll be color. And then I go to the trait after that, it'll be insect damage. And now we're at the bottom of our list. And so going to the next trait takes me to height. But with this setting active, it also moves me to plot number 11. And so once you cycle through that list of traits, it moves you forward a plot. And so if I just go through them all, recreates the next entry button, essentially. Any questions about that one? That one always gets questions. So I'm a little suspect if there's no questions. No questions? No, okay. I guess you just had this, so you know. And I think that was the last advanced setting to cover. Oh, there's two more. But I'll just talk about these ones as well. So similar to the first one that we talked about, where we can go to the next entry with no data, we can also hide entries with no data. And this is what we originally had, and I can't take out features because people complain, so I put it close to the bottom. But it's a combination of not being able to go to an entry that does have data collected. So once you type data in for that trait, you can't go back if you go forward. And it'll take you to the next empty one too. But then if you go back to the previous empty one. So if you never want to see your data again, but know that it's stored, so you don't want anyone to ever change it, then that's the trait for you. So the last one is using the day of the year. And so for our date traits, by default, those are collected with the date. But some people always do their calculations from the number of days from January 1st. And so this converts those ones that are subsequently collected to that style instead. It doesn't convert the previously collected ones. So you need to select it before you collect data. So those are both of the advanced settings. Okay, and so I talked a little bit about how to integrate barcodes to move to different plots, but I didn't talk about using barcodes to actually collect data. And so in our lab, we do it two different ways. We have this centimeter height stick with barcodes at centimeter increments. Every barcode corresponds to the number of centimeters from the ground. We can put that next to our plot. We can scan the height of that barcode, and then that's stored in Fieldbook in the text trait. So barcode scanners really just act like keyboards. You should just always think of them as keyboards. And so then they just type that value into the text trait, and if they're programmed correctly, they go to the next value or the next entry after they store that value. We've continued, so we did the centimeter height stick for a long time, but we've also added this millimeter ruler, I guess not technically a ruler, but to measure things like leaf length. And in this case, the leaves block any of the barcodes, and so you just start from the bottom, you scan up, and the first successful barcode scan is the length of the leaf. Okay, so we have two different formats built into Fieldbook that you can export data as. So I'm just gonna go back to this. So if I open up export, we can select the two different formats. So we have database and we have table. And then our next choice is the field columns that we want to include. So our original field file had our unique ID, our primary order, our secondary order, and then just a bunch of extra columns. So we have two different choices. We can have only the unique ID be exported, which a lot of times if you're going into a database, you just need a way to connect the data. You don't care about everything else since it's already in the database. Or we can have all of our imported columns be exported. Along the same lines, with the traits, we can have only the active traits, only the ones with check marks, or we can have all of the traits. And so when you're exporting, you get to just make these decisions depending on the type of data that you want and what you're going to do with it. Underneath that, we have our file name. So the file names are named for today's date and time, and then the name of the field that was originally imported. And you can edit that. We also have an option to overwrite a previously exported file. And so if you are exporting a file or say a trial regularly every day, after you've collected the data, you don't want days and days of files to have to go through. And so what this option will do will move older copies that match this same or similar naming scheme to an archive folder. Doesn't actually overwrite or delete anything, but it gets it out of the folder where things are exported. And so just to kind of distinguish between the two different export formats, so in database, each row is a single measurement, whereas in table, each row is a single plot. So you can see some of the differences built in. In our database format, we have a unique ID, our plot ID. We have the trait that we are collecting, in this case height, and we have the value that we stored for that trait. What this also gives us, though, is the person who collected the data, who collected this specific data point, and the time when this specific data point was collected. Versus table, where this entire row is for this plot ID, and each of these columns are for the traits that were collected in the field. The database that Android uses to store files, so converting between this format to this format requires, this is just like on the database nerd side, so it's going to be technical jargon for a lot of people. But it requires, there's a few ways to do it, but it requires a lot of, the way I'm doing it requires a lot of join commands. And the database format that Fieldbook and Android uses by default only allows up to 64 join commands. I'm checking a few other approaches to see if that can be revised. I can't promise anything, though. The one thing, I mean, it's always nice to just pass on to someone else. The one thing that is possible is that you'd be able to upload that database format, because you can still export the database with as many traits as you want. So going back to the original folder that we loaded up to kind of show the file structure of Fieldbook, within that folder, so we have our, I'm just going to go through each of these. We have our archive folder where anything overwritten would go. We have our database folder where you would export or import the entire Fieldbook database. We have our field export, and this is where any exported data goes to. We have our field import, and this is where the files that you're going to import into Fieldbook go to. And then to answer your question, we have our plot data folder. And within this, so if I open this one up, we have the names of the fields that we have. If we've collected photos or audio for those fields. In this case, we have photos, except we don't have any photos. Let me check the other one. So yeah, now we have the photos. And then the photo is named with the unique ID, the trait name, the number of the photo that it is, and the timestamp. So it's just in a different folder on the device. Yes?
I just sent the trait file and the field layout.
Okay.
I was trying to see if people want to download them. It's in their email.
Okay. I think we're just going to probably do it after the fact.
Sure.
Yep.
Just to mention it to them so that we can.
Yep. Yes?
So you don't need to export. By default, it goes there.
Yeah, so the photos are saved separately. You can't put a photo into a CSV file or they'd be embedded. But within the CSV file, there's a link to the photo. It shows, not like a clickable link, but it shows the directory of where the photo is stored. Okay, so just finishing the last three. We have a resources folder. I'll talk about this one in a second. I overlooked this one a little bit. If we're exporting or importing traits, we put them into the trait folder. If they're exported, that's where they go. And then we have an updates folder, which you don't have to worry about, but that's where some updates will be downloaded. Just going back to, okay. So back on the main screen, I overlooked these buttons at the top. And so we have 4 different buttons up here, and I'm gonna go from right to left, actually. So the first one on the far right is the lock button. And so if we select that, it's really subtle if you're far away, but all of these buttons, except for the image one, are grayed out. And you can't type anything. So you can see my cursor, but you can't type anything. If there's data in there, then you can't change the data. So this was requested by a peach breeder who didn't want anyone to change her data. And it really just lets you lock down the data and doesn't let you do anything. So the next one is our plot summary. And so if we select that piece of paper icon up at the top, this is all of the data about this plot. All of the data that was imported, all of the data that's been collected. So we have all of our imported columns going down to pedigree, and then we have the height value that I just collected. This is a really easy way to get a complete summary about a specific entry, or to see all of your data at once. Our next icon over is the folder with a star, and this is our resources folder. And so if we have something that we want to access, a scoring template or scoring guide or really any kind of just resource that you might want to access, you can put it into this folder back on our device, so into our resources folder, that one. And then it'll be listed here. And so I have 2 samples in there. We have our, if it opens, we have our growth stage scoring for wheat. And then we have another one that was just a simple, I think stem rust scoring as well. Okay, so the 4th icon over is a search button. So if we click on that, this essentially lets you build queries to search for plots or values within the fieldbook database. And so if I want to search for a specific row, so if I drop that down, select row, and have that equal to 1, I'll click OK. And now I have all of the results that match that query. And if I want to go to one of those plots, I can select that plot, and now I'm on plot number 14. So a lot of the different features that are built into Fieldbook are really just there to help navigate quicker or more quickly. You don't need them. I mean, you can tap, 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 as a lot of people so eloquently refer to it on the arrows, and move forward and backward, and that's completely fine. But when you have thousands of entries that you need to go through rapidly, sometimes that doesn't always make the most sense. And so I think that's all I have to cover. So if there are any other questions,